The morning light, thin and watery, filtered through the lace curtains, painting a fragile pattern on the worn wooden floor. Margaret Ellison watched a robin tugging at a worm in her small garden, her gaze distant and unfocused. She lifted her hand to adjust her glasses, a familiar gesture, but this time a tremor ran through her fingers, a subtle, insistent quiver that betrayed her 82 years. It was a fleeting thing, quickly dismissed, yet a sliver of unease, like a hairline crack in a porcelain vase, began to spread through her. It wasn't the tremor itself, but the whisper of vulnerability it carried, a stark reminder of the slow, insidious creep of time. She'd always been the sturdy oak, weathering every storm, but lately she felt more like the brittle leaves, clinging precariously to the branch. The sound of a car pulling up startled her. Janelle. Her daughter's visits were usually predictable, Sunday afternoons filled with forced cheer and thinly veiled assessments of her declining health. But this was a Wednesday. Margaret's hand went instinctively to smooth her already neat hair, a nervous habit from a lifetime of maintaining appearances. She pulled back the curtain a fraction, her breath catching in her throat. Janelle's car sat idling at the curb, its engine a low, insistent hum that mirrored the growing disquiet in Margaret's chest. "Be ready by 8, I'm picking you up," Janelle had said the previous night, her voice clipped and devoid of its usual warmth. The words echoed in Margaret's mind, sharp and unsettling. Something didn't sit right. The cryptic message, the unusual time, the curt tone, they all coalesced into a knot of apprehension that tightened with each passing second. She glanced around her small, cluttered living room, a space filled with the accumulated memories of a lifetime. Was this it? The moment she dreaded, the forced exodus from her sanctuary? The insistent rap on the door jolted her from a reverie. She opened it slowly, her gaze meeting Janelle's. Her daughter's face, usually so expressive, was a mask of controlled composure, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that Margaret recognized, a weariness born from carrying burdens both visible and unseen. "Ready, Mom?" Janelle's voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it lacked the usual playful lilt. Margaret hesitated, a flicker of defiance sparking in her eyes. "Ready for what? You never said." The question hung in the air, a silent challenge. Janelle sighed, a sound laced with frustration. "Just come on, Mom. We need to go." The car ride was a study in contrasts. Outside, the vibrant tapestry of a bustling city unfolded, a blur of color and movement. Inside, a strained silence hung heavy, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Margaret stole glances at Janelle, trying to decipher the meaning behind her daughter's tight lips and furrowed brow. Was it anger? Concern? Margaret's mind raced, conjuring up a kaleidoscope of possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. She felt a growing resentment, a prickly defensiveness against the unspoken accusation, the implicit judgment. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Janelle's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You'll see." The non-answer was like a physical blow. Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the familiar panic rising in her throat. This was it. They were taking her away, to one of those sterile, antiseptic places filled with the ghosts of forgotten lives. The thought was unbearable, a suffocating blanket of despair. She'd rather die in her own home, surrounded by her own things, her own memories. The car eventually pulled into a quiet, tree-lined street. Margaret looked out the window, her heart sinking. It wasn't a nursing home. It was a house. A small, charming house with a freshly painted porch and a vibrant flower garden. Confusion warred with a flicker of hope in her chest. This wasn't what she expected. Janelle parked the car and turned to her, a tentative smile playing on her lips. "Come on, Mom. Let me show you something." Margaret stepped out of the car, her legs shaky. She followed Janelle up the path, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Janelle opened the front door, revealing a bright, airy living room, filled with sunlight and the scent of fresh paint. Margaret gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. The furniture was new, yet carefully chosen, echoing the style and comfort of her own home. Family photos, meticulously arranged, adorned the walls, their familiar faces smiling back at her. In the corner, her antique grandfather clock stood tall and proud, its rhythmic ticking a comforting presence in the unfamiliar space. "I don't understand," Margaret stammered, her voice thick with emotion. Janelle took her hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling, "I know how much you value your independence. I know how much you hate the idea of being a burden." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not a burden," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I know, Mom. I know. But I also know you're struggling. And I can't stand the thought of you being alone, afraid, and Janelle's voice broke. "This is for me?" Margaret asked, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every detail, every carefully chosen piece. Janelle nodded, a small smile gracing her lips. "I bought it a few months ago. Spent every weekend renovating it, trying to make it feel like home." Margaret reached out and touched the smooth surface of a nearby table, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. It was real. This wasn't a dream. A wave of warmth washed over her, melting the icy fear that had gripped her heart. This wasn't a prison, a place of confinement. It was a gift, a testament to the enduring power of love. A sanctuary, a new beginning. The hum of the car engine was a low, persistent thrum against the silence that had settled between them. Margaret gripped the worn leather of her handbag, her knuckles bone white against the faded material. Outside, the familiar cityscape of brick and glass gave way to stretches of green, blurring past in a disorienting rush. Unease, a cold, creeping tendril, coiled in the pit of her stomach. Where was Janelle taking her? Not the hospital, surely. They'd passed St. Michael's miles back. The weekly grocery run never took this route either. A faint, medicinal smell clung to the car's upholstery, a scent that brought back unwelcome memories of sterile waiting rooms and the ghostly echo of hushed conversations. "Janelle," she began, her voice a brittle whisper that betrayed none of the fear tightening its grip around her heart. Janelle's reply was non-committal, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Margaret watched her daughter's profile, the tight set of her jaw, the way her fingers drummed a restless rhythm against the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice gaining a slight edge. "Just a little drive, Mom," Janelle replied, offering a fleeting, strained smile. "A drive?" Margaret scoffed internally. At this time of day? With her dressed in her Sunday best? She wasn't a fool. The evasiveness in Janelle's voice, the forced casualness, it all pointed to one dreadful conclusion. A place she'd vowed she would never set foot in. A place where independence withered and died. They passed a familiar bakery, the one where Janelle used to buy her those cream-filled pastries she adored. A wave of nostalgia, bittersweet and sharp, washed over her. Those were simpler times. Times before the creeping forgetfulness, before the trembling hands, before the world began to tilt on its axis. Now, the bakery was just another landmark that confirmed her suspicions. They were heading east, further and further away from everything she knew. The scenery continued to morph, the urban landscape replaced by sprawling lawns and manicured hedges. She noticed a road sign flash past, Maple Grove, 5 miles. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled gasp. Maple Grove. The name, synonymous with surrender, echoed in her mind. The senior living facility. The place Janelle had subtly suggested. The place she had vehemently refused. A cold dread washed over her, a chilling certainty that solidified her worst fears. They were taking her away. "Janelle," she said, her voice now trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Where are we going?" Janelle's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles white against the leather. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. A sigh escaped her lips, a sound heavy with resignation. "Maple Grove Senior Living," she finally admitted, the words barely a whisper. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Margaret felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. All the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her, the fierce independence she clung to, crumbled under the weight of this stark reality. She'd spent her entire life caring for others, raising Janelle single-handedly, navigating a world that wasn't always kind. Now, in her twilight years, she was being reduced to this a burden, a problem to be solved. "Pull over," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. "Pull over now." Janelle hesitated, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mom, we can talk about this. Pull over." Margaret's voice rose, the fear and anger boiling over. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The car, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage. Janelle, her face etched with worry, reluctantly pulled the car onto the side of the road. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. Margaret stared straight ahead, her vision blurred with unshed tears. The world outside seemed to spin, the manicured lawns of Maple Grove mocking her in their pristine, sterile perfection. She closed her eyes, tried to regain control, to quell the rising panic. Janelle reached out, her hand hovering hesitantly over Margaret's arm. "Mom," she began, her voice soft, laced with a pain that mirrored her own. "I know you don't want this, but—" Margaret flinched, pulling away from her daughter's touch. "But what, Janelle? But I'm old? But I'm forgetful? But I'm a burden?" The words tumbled out, sharp and accusatory, laced with the bitterness of a lifetime of suppressed emotions. Janelle's hand retreated, her expression a mixture of hurt and frustration. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words, words that could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Finally, she took a deep breath, a tremor running through her frame. "Mom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look." Margaret hesitantly turned her head, following Janelle's gaze. In the distance, nestled amongst a cluster of trees, sat a small, charming house, freshly painted in a cheerful shade of yellow. Smoke curled from the chimney, a wisp of warmth against the crisp autumn air. Confusion clouded Margaret's mind. This wasn't Maple Grove. This wasn't anything she recognized. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice laced with bewilderment. A faint smile played on Janelle's lips, a smile that held a trace of sadness, but also a profound love. "That's your new house, Mom," she said softly. "I bought it a few months ago. Had it renovated. It's all yours." The car's interior felt suffocating. Margaret gripped the worn leather of her handbag, its familiar texture a small comfort in the rising tide of anxiety that clawed at her throat. Outside, the blurred landscape of strip malls and gas stations whizzed by, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within her. She stole a glance at Janelle, her daughter's profile rigid against the backdrop of the setting sun. The silence stretched, heavy and accusatory. Each passing mile marker felt like another nail in the coffin of her independence. So, Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice brittle, each word meticulously chosen. "Isn't that what this is? Isn't that where we're going?" The question hung in the air, a venomous wisp of unspoken fears. Margaret knew, with a chilling certainty, what her daughter intended. This drive, this sudden, unexplained detour, it all pointed to one inevitable conclusion: a nursing home. The thought pricked at her pride, a sharp, stinging insult to her self-sufficiency. She'd always managed, always coped, even after Edward, the familiar ache in her chest resurfaced. She swallowed hard, pushing the grief down, refusing to give Janelle the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Janelle's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The silence stretched, each second a confirmation of Margaret's suspicions. Abandonment. That's what this was. Just like no. She wouldn't let herself go there. Not again. She fixed her gaze on the passing scenery, the vibrant hues of the sunset mocking the bleakness that had settled in her heart. The silence was a deafening roar, amplifying the sense of betrayal that gnawed at her. Didn't she deserve better than this? After all these years, after all she'd done, Janelle's internal monologue raged. Her mother's words, barbed with accusation, echoed in her mind. The unspoken resentments, the years of careful maneuvering around her mother's prickly pride, it all threatened to spill over. She felt a surge of exhaustion, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She hadn't wanted this confrontation, this painful dance around the inevitable. But how could she stand by and watch her mother slowly fade, her memory a tattered tapestry of forgotten moments? The recent incidents flashed through her mind. The burnt pot roast, the forgotten medication, the near miss with the stove fear, sharp and cold, gripped her heart. She had to do something. Janelle took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of the car freshener, a sickly sweet vanilla, doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. She glanced at her mother, her face etched with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. Suddenly, the anger dissipated, replaced by a wave of aching tenderness. This proud, stubborn woman, who had weathered so many storms, was now facing the inevitable decline of age, her fiercely guarded independence crumbling like dry leaves in the autumn wind. How could she make her understand? "Do you really think I'd do that to you?" Janelle finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, choked with unshed tears. Margaret's gaze snapped to her daughter, her eyes widening slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in their depths. The question, soft yet laden with emotion, pierced through the wall of her defenses. The accusatory tone, the bitterness she had clung to, began to dissolve. A memory, vivid and poignant, surfaced from the depths of her consciousness. A young Janelle, no older than 8, clutching a wilted dandelion, her face streaked with tears. Margaret, younger, her face less lined with worry, knelt beside her, her arms offering a comforting embrace. "Don't cry, Janie," she murmured, stroking the girl's hair. "Mommy's here. Mommy will always be here for you." The memory hung in the air, a silent testament to a bond forged in love and hardship. Margaret's breath hitched, the years melting away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Had she truly believed Janelle would abandon her? The thought felt alien, a cruel distortion of the unwavering love she knew existed between them. Her carefully constructed facade of indifference began to crumble, revealing the fear that had been festering beneath the surface. The fear of being alone, of being forgotten, of losing her grip on the last vestiges of her independence. Janelle pulled the car over to the side of the road, the sudden stop jolting Margaret back to the present. The silence that followed was different now, no longer charged with accusation, but heavy with unspoken emotions. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dashboard, painting the interior in hues of orange and purple. Margaret's grip on her handbag loosened, her fingers tracing the worn leather, a small, familiar comfort in the face of this unexpected shift. Janelle turned to her mother, her expression softened with a mixture of love and sadness. "Mom," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I would never do that to you. Never." Margaret looked at her daughter, her eyes searching, seeking reassurance in the depths of Janelle's gaze. The years of carefully guarded emotions threatened to break free, the dam of her pride cracking under the weight of her daughter's unwavering love. "Then where are we going?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question laced with a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to express in years. Janelle reached out, her hand covering her mother's, the warmth of her touch a silent promise. "We're going home, Mom," she said, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "To your new home." Margaret's brow furrowed, confusion clouding her features. "New home," she echoed, her voice tinged with bewilderment. "But," Janelle squeezed her mother's hand, her smile widening. "It's a surprise," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that melted the last vestiges of Margaret's apprehension. "I've been working on it for months. I think you're going to love it." As Janelle pulled back onto the road, the setting sun casting a warm glow on her face, Margaret leaned back against the headrest, a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension swirling within her. The familiar landscape, once a blur of anxiety-inducing motion, now seemed to hold a promise, a glimmer of hope in the fading light. The unknown stretched before her, a path shrouded in mystery. But for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a flicker of something akin to peace. The grip of fear loosened its hold, replaced by a fragile sense of trust, a quiet understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, this new chapter wouldn't be so bad after all. Perhaps, in this unexpected turn of events, she might find a different kind of independence, a different kind of home. The chipped porcelain doll lay discarded in the corner, its painted eyes staring blankly at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. 7-year-old Janelle watched it, a familiar hollowness settling in her chest. Another family had come and gone, their smiles fading as they drove away, leaving her in the echoing silence of the foster home. She didn't cry. Crying never changed anything. Mrs. Henderson, the foster mother, a woman whose kindness felt as thin and brittle as the doll's porcelain skin, offered a sympathetic pat on the head. They just weren't the right fit, Janie. Don't you worry. Your family is out there somewhere. Janelle didn't believe her. Family. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Then Margaret arrived, a tall, imposing woman with eyes that seemed to hold both a chilling frost and a flickering ember. She didn't smile, didn't offer sweets or promises of picnics. She simply observed Janelle, her gaze sharp and unwavering, dissecting the layers of carefully constructed indifference the girl wore like armor. "Janelle," she said, her voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the frantic thump of Janelle's heart. "Come with me." No promises, no reassurances, just a statement of fact. And yet, in that stark simplicity, Janelle felt a strange pull, a fragile thread of hope unfurling within the tightly wound knot of her loneliness. Life with Margaret wasn't easy. There was a strictness, an almost militaristic order to their days. Chores were completed without complaint, meals were eaten in silence, emotions were kept tightly leashed. Margaret wasn't cruel, but neither was she affectionate. Her love was a quiet presence, a steady hand on the rudder in a stormy sea. Janelle, accustomed to the fleeting warmth of temporary caregivers, found this stoicism unsettling. She craved overt displays of affection, the whispered reassurances that she was wanted, loved. But Margaret offered none of these. Teenage years brought a new wave of challenges. The whispers in school hallways, the pitying glances, the knowledge that she was different, set apart. She learned to build walls around her heart, mirroring Margaret's reserved nature. "Why don't you talk to me?" Margaret asked one evening, her voice tight with an emotion Janelle couldn't decipher. Janelle shrugged, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "There's nothing to say." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Inside, Janelle screamed, "Tell me you love me. Tell me I'm enough." But the words remained locked within the cage of her throat. Later, in the suffocating darkness of her room, Janelle replayed the scene, dissecting every nuance of Margaret's expression, every inflection in her voice. Was it concern she saw in those usually glacial eyes? Or disappointment? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a constant, dull ache. She hated this feeling, this vulnerability that threatened to shatter the carefully constructed facade of indifference. Margaret's silence felt like rejection, a confirmation of her deepest fear, that she wasn't worthy of love, that she was a burden, a responsibility, but not a daughter. Years passed. Janelle became a social worker, her choice of profession a reflection of her own fractured past, a desperate attempt to mend the broken pieces in other people's lives. She learned to navigate the complex landscape of human emotions, to decipher the unspoken words, the hidden traumas. Yet, with Margaret, she remained at a loss. Their relationship was a carefully choreographed dance around the unspoken, a delicate balance between closeness and distance. Margaret, now in her 80s, was starting to forget things, misplacing keys, repeating stories. Her fierce independence was slowly eroding, replaced by a growing dependence that she vehemently denied. Janelle saw the signs, the subtle tremors in Margaret's hands, the flicker of confusion in her eyes. She knew what needed to be done, but the thought of confronting Margaret filled her with dread. The memory of a particularly harsh winter evening surfaced, unbidden. Janelle, then 16, had run away, fueled by a teenage cocktail of angst and resentment. Margaret had found her huddled in a bus station, shivering and scared. There were no recriminations, no lectures, just a firm grip on her arm and the quiet words, "Come home." Later, wrapped in a warm blanket, sipping hot chocolate, Janelle had finally dared to ask, "Why did you adopt me?" Margaret's reply was simple, devoid of sentimentality. Someone needed to. At the time, Janelle interpreted this as a lack of affection. But now, years later, a different understanding began to dawn. Margaret's reserved nature, her tough love, wasn't a lack of love, but a shield, a way to keep Janelle going amidst the swirling chaos of her past. It was a lifeline thrown in the midst of storm. Now, facing Margaret's declining health, Janelle felt a surge of protective fierceness. "You can't keep living like this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You need help." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't need your pity. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "It's not pity," Janelle replied, her voice rising in frustration. "It's concern. You're not safe living alone anymore." Margaret turned away, her shoulders slumped, a fragile vulnerability peeking through the cracks in her carefully constructed armor. "You raised me to survive," Janelle continued, her voice softening, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You taught me to be strong, to face the world head-on. But this isn't about strength, Mom. It's about accepting that things change, that sometimes we need each other." The word "mom," rarely spoken, hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of them, taken years ago, Janelle's arm around Margaret's shoulder, a rare moment of unguarded affection captured in time. "I'm not ashamed of you," Janelle whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm terrified of losing you." Margaret turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The carefully constructed walls around her heart began to crumble, revealing the raw, vulnerable woman beneath. Janelle took a deep breath. "I bought a house," she said, her voice steady now, the culmination of months of planning and secret arrangements. "A small one with a garden. I've had it renovated, made it safe, comfortable. You can have your own space, your independence, but you'll have support, people nearby if you need them." Margaret stared at her, speechless, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Janelle held her gaze, her own eyes filled with a love that had been decades in the making, a love that had weathered storms and silences, a love as strong and enduring as the woman standing before her. The chipped porcelain doll, a relic of a painful past, lay forgotten in the corner. In its place, a new image emerged, a small house with a garden, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, a symbol of hope, a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience. The hum of the car engine filled the silence between them, a low, thrumming counterpoint to the tension that crackled in the air. Janelle gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, stretching and distorting the familiar landscape into something almost alien. "Just breathe, Janelle. Breathe." Her mother, Margaret, sat beside her, ramrod straight, a statue carved from pride and resentment. The silence was heavy, laden with unspoken words and years of carefully constructed emotional barricades. Margaret's hands, knotted in her lap, trembled slightly, a betrayal of the stoicism she so fiercely maintained. "She thinks I'm a burden," Margaret thought, the familiar sting of vulnerability making her chest ache. "She's just waiting for me to crumble." The drive to Margaret's small, two-story house felt longer than usual, each mile stretching out like an eternity. When they arrived, the familiar scent of lavender and old books that permeated the house usually brought Janelle a sense of comfort. Today, it felt suffocating, a poignant reminder of a life her mother was so desperately clinging to, a life that was slowly slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. "I can manage, Janelle," Margaret said, her voice brittle, as she fumbled with her keys at the front door. The simple act, once so automatic, now seemed a monumental task. Janelle watched, her heart clenching, the urge to reach out and help almost overwhelming. "It's not just about managing, Ma," she thought, the words catching in her throat. "It's about being safe, about not being alone." Inside, the house felt colder than usual, the air stagnant. Margaret moved slowly, her steps hesitant, as she made her way to the kitchen. Janelle followed, her gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings, noticing the chipped paint on the windowsill, the stack of unopened mail on the counter, the faint smell of burnt toast lingering in the air. Each detail, once overlooked, now screamed of her mother's increasing fragility. "I made a pot roast," Margaret announced, a forced brightness in her voice. Janelle knew it was a lie. The pot roast had been in the freezer for weeks, a relic of a time when Margaret still had the energy to cook. She opened the refrigerator, confirming her suspicion. Empty, save for a carton of expired milk and a jar of pickles. "She's trying to pretend, for both of us," Janelle realized, a wave of sadness washing over her. "She's more afraid than she lets on." Dinner was a strained affair. Margaret picked at her food, her gaze flitting nervously around the room. Janelle tried to keep the conversation light, but every attempt felt forced, met with monosyllabic responses and strained smiles. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken worries and the weight of their changing roles. Later, as Janelle helped Margaret clear the table, a glass slipped from Margaret's trembling hand, shattering on the tiled floor. The sharp sound seemed to reverberate through the quiet house, shattering the fragile peace they had managed to maintain. Margaret stared at the broken shards, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I didn't mean," she stammered, her voice trailing off. Tears welled up, blurring her vision. In that moment, the carefully constructed wall of pride crumbled, revealing the frightened, vulnerable woman beneath. Janelle knelt beside her, gathering the broken pieces. "It's okay, Ma," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just a glass." But it wasn't just a glass. It was a symbol of everything that was changing, of the life that was slowly slipping away. That night, after tucking her mother into bed, Janelle sat in her own living room, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The exhaustion was bone deep, but sleep remained elusive. The conversation they'd had in the car echoed in her ears. "This is my house. I don't need saving." "You're not being saved, Ma. You're being cared for." "You think I'm helpless?" Margaret's words, sharp and accusatory, had stung, but Janelle knew they stemmed from fear, not anger. She understood her mother's fierce independence, her deep-seated need to maintain control. But she also knew that denial couldn't last forever. A new resolve hardened in Janelle's chest. Asking wasn't working. It was time to tell. A secret she had carefully guarded for months now felt like the only solution. A weight lifted from her shoulders as she made the decision. She wouldn't ask her mother to move. She would offer her a home, a place where she could be safe, cared for, and yet still maintain a semblance of independence. The next morning, armed with a newfound determination, Janelle drove back to her mother's house. She found Margaret in the garden, struggling to weed the flower beds. Her movements were slow and labored, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Janelle watched for a moment, her heart aching with a mixture of love and frustration. "Ma," she began, her voice firm but gentle, "I need to show you something." Margaret looked up, her eyes wary, a flicker of apprehension in their depths. "What new torment is this?" she wondered, bracing herself for another argument, another attempt to convince her to give up her home, her life. Janelle led her mother to the car, a sense of anticipation bubbling beneath her anxiety. The drive was short, filled with Margaret's nervous questioning and Janelle's evasive answers. They pulled up in front of a small, newly renovated cottage, nestled amongst a cluster of trees. The house was painted a cheerful yellow, with white trim and a welcoming front porch. Margaret stared at it, her eyes wide with confusion. What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Janelle took her mother's hand, her own trembling slightly. "This is yours, Ma," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I bought it for you. It's yours." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken love and years of carefully concealed worry. Margaret stared at the house, her mind struggling to process the information. A wave of emotions washed over her: confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of something akin to hope. She turned to Janelle, her eyes filled with tears. "But why?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Janelle wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her close. "Because I love you, Ma," she said, her voice trembling. "And I want you to be safe." In that moment, the years of unspoken words, the carefully constructed walls of pride and independence, crumbled away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered love between a mother and a daughter. The vinyl seat stuck to the back of Janelle's thighs as she shifted in the driver's seat, the worn leather a familiar discomfort. Her mother, Margaret, sat rigidly beside her, a statue carved from anxiety and thinly veiled resentment. The silence in the car was a heavy, palpable thing, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swoosh of the windshield wipers battling the persistent drizzle. Janelle glanced at her mother's profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the way her lips were pressed together, a thin white line against the pale skin. It was a familiar mask, one Margaret wore when she felt cornered, threatened. "She thinks I'm taking her to Maple Grove," Janelle thought, a knot tightening in her stomach. "She sees right through me." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them, an invisible barrier thicker than any spoken accusation. Margaret gripped her purse tightly, knuckles bone-white against the worn leather. The rhythmic thump of her heart echoed, the relentless drum of the rain against the car windows. Each droplet seemed to magnify her unease, reflecting her own turbulent inner world. Maple Grove. Even the name tasted like ash in her mouth. A place for the forgotten, the discarded. She hadn't spoken a word since Janelle had helped her into the car, but a cold dread had settled in her stomach, coiling around her insides like a venomous snake. She's doing it, she thought, her mind a whirlwind of suspicion and hurt. She's decided I'm too much trouble. The idea was a sharp, stinging slap, more painful than any physical ailment. Independence, self-sufficiency, these were the pillars of Margaret's life, the foundations upon which she had built her identity. To have them stripped away, to be deemed incapable, was a humiliation she couldn't bear to contemplate. The car slowed, and Margaret's breath hitched as they approached the Maple Grove exit. The large green sign loomed ahead, each letter a stark confirmation of her worst fears. A choked sound escaped her throat, a mixture of pride and terror. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice raspy with unshed tears. The words were barely audible, yet they resonated in the confined space of the car, each syllable a tiny shard of glass piercing the strained silence. Janelle's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She could feel her mother's gaze on her, sharp and accusing. "Mom," she began, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. This isn't, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain, when even to herself, her actions felt tangled, motivated by a desperate love that bordered on desperation? "You think I'm a burden," Margaret finished, her voice gaining strength, laced with a bitter certainty that cut Janelle to the quick. Each word was a precise, calculated strike, aimed at the heart of Janelle's carefully constructed composure. She saw the flicker of pain in her daughter's eyes, and a perverse satisfaction twisted within her, a fleeting triumph in the midst of defeat. Janelle took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain eye contact with the road ahead, the blurring landscape a reflection of her own swirling thoughts. "This isn't about getting rid of you," she said, her voice strained. "It's about keeping you safe." The words felt hollow even to her own ears, a flimsy shield against the storm of her mother's emotions. Safe, she thought bitterly. Safe from what? From living her own life? The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Safe. Margaret scoffed a dry, brittle sound. "You're ashamed of me. You don't want to have to deal with me anymore." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken years of carefully guarded emotions. Years of a love expressed through duty, through practicalities, rather than open affection. Janelle's grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles were white. The urge to defend herself, to justify her actions, was almost overwhelming. But beneath the anger and frustration, a deeper, more profound emotion stirred within her. A weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from years of carrying this burden of unspoken anxieties and carefully managed expectations. She knew that her mother wouldn't understand. Not yet. Perhaps never. Instead of arguing, Janelle took a different route, one that led away from the sterile, impersonal walls of Maple Grove. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less charged, less suffocating. It was the silence of anticipation, of a secret held just below the surface. As the familiar landscape gave way to unfamiliar streets, Margaret's anxiety morphed into a bewildered curiosity. She watched the scenery change, the neat suburban houses giving way to older, more established homes, each with its own unique character. The rain had stopped, and a watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft, ethereal glow on the wet streets. Janelle finally pulled up in front of a small, two-story house with a freshly painted porch and blooming flower boxes overflowing with vibrant impatience. The house had a warm, inviting aura, a sense of peace that settled over Margaret like a comforting blanket. She looked at her daughter, her eyes wide with confusion. Janelle turned off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the rapid beating of her own heart. "I didn't take you to Maple Grove, Mom," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I bought you a house." Margaret stared at her, speechless. The carefully constructed walls of her pride began to crumble, replaced by a wave of emotion she couldn't quite comprehend. Disbelief, confusion, a flicker of hope, all warred within her. This is for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked at the house again, at the welcoming glow of the windows, and a strange feeling, a mixture of vulnerability and a tentative joy, began to bloom in her chest. Janelle nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's all yours. I had it renovated, made it safer." The word hung in the air, no longer a threat, but a promise. Margaret's gaze shifted back to her daughter, her eyes searching Janelle's face, looking for the hidden agenda, the ulterior motive. But all she saw was love, raw and unfiltered. A love that, despite its clumsiness, its sometimes misguided attempts at protection, was undeniably real. The carefully constructed barriers of a lifetime began to dissolve, leaving her feeling exposed, vulnerable, and strangely, wonderfully free. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, a testament to the unspoken emotions that finally, after all these years, had found a way to surface. "Oh, Janelle," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words were simple, yet they held a lifetime of unspoken love and gratitude. The late afternoon sun, a hazy apricot hue, filtered through the lace curtains, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Margaret's hand, gnarled with age, trembled as it traced the delicate floral pattern of the fabric. She inhaled deeply, the faint scent of lavender and beeswax filling her lungs. It smelled like new beginnings, like hope. But hope, she'd learned, was a fragile thing, easily crushed beneath the weight of years and regrets. Janelle watched her mother, a familiar ache tightening in her chest. She saw the apprehension etched on her face, the flicker of suspicion in her eyes. It was the same look Margaret wore whenever Janelle suggested change, a shift in the carefully constructed fortress of her independence. "It's charming," Margaret finally said, her voice a low murmur, barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The words were polite, non-committal, yet Janelle sensed a crack in her mother's usual stoicism. "Charming," Janelle echoed, a wry smile playing on her lips. That's one word for it. I was going for breathtaking, but I'll take charming. Margaret turned, her gaze sweeping over the living room. It was small, cozy, with a fireplace that begged for crackling logs and a worn armchair angled towards the window, overlooking a riot of blooming roses. Everything was new, yet imbued with a sense of timeless comfort, a feeling of home. Janelle had spent weeks, months even, painstakingly renovating this small cottage, pouring her heart and soul into every detail, hoping, praying that it would be enough. Margaret's silence stretched, a heavy blanket of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Janelle could practically hear the gears turning in her mother's mind. The relentless calculations, the weighing of pros and cons. Was this a trick? A subtle maneuver to finally wrest control, to force her into accepting a life she vehemently refused? Margaret's pride, a formidable shield forged over decades of hardship, bristled at the thought. She straightened her spine, her eyes hardening. It's lovely, Janelle. Truly. But why? Janelle sighed, a wisp of air escaping her lips. This was the hard part, the unveiling of the truth, the laying bare of emotions she'd kept buried for so long. She crossed the room, her steps slow and deliberate, and knelt before her mother, taking her frail hands in her own. The touch sent a jolt of warmth through Margaret, a flicker of something long forgotten. "This is yours, Mom," Janelle said, her voice soft yet firm. "Ours. A place where you can be safe, where you don't have to worry about the stairs, or the leaky roof, or being alone." Margaret's eyes widened, a hint of vulnerability finally breaking through the carefully constructed facade. "Alone?" she whispered, the word catching in her throat. It was the unspoken fear that haunted her waking moments and plagued her sleep, the terrifying prospect of facing the inevitable decline without a lifeline, without a hand to hold in the encroaching darkness. Janelle tightened her grip on her mother's hands. "I know you've been struggling, Mom. I see it. The forgotten appointments, the misplaced keys, the near falls. I'm fine," Margaret retorted, her voice sharp, defensive. But the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She pulled away, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. The flickering light illuminated the deep lines etched around her eyes, the map of a life lived with unwavering strength and a carefully guarded heart. "I know you're scared," Janelle continued undeterred. "I'm scared too, but we don't have to be scared alone." A long silence hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to amplify the weight of the moment, the years of unspoken words and buried resentments. Margaret's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of her and Janelle, taken years ago. Janelle, a young girl with bright, curious eyes, and Margaret, her face softened by a rare smile. "I didn't know how to be soft, Janelle," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, like shards of glass. I thought if I was hard on you, the world couldn't hurt you more than I already had." Janelle's breath hitched in her throat. She'd spent years trying to decipher her mother's emotional distance, attributing it to coldness, to a lack of affection. Now, hearing the raw vulnerability in her voice, she understood. The hardness, the unwavering discipline, it wasn't a rejection. It was a shield, a twisted form of love. "You saved me, Mom," Janelle said, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me how to be strong, how to survive. Even when I didn't understand, even when it hurt." Margaret turned back to her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I love you, Janelle," she whispered, the words heavy with a lifetime of unexpressed emotion. "More than I ever knew how to show." Janelle rose and pulled her mother into a hug, a tight embrace that spanned the years, bridging the chasm of misunderstanding. The scent of lavender and beeswax filled the air, a promise of new beginnings, of a future filled with shared moments and unspoken understanding. The afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. But within the small cottage, a warmth bloomed, a silent promise of love and resilience in the face of the encroaching twilight. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer held the same sting, the same icy grip. Now, there was a hand to hold, a shared warmth against the approaching darkness. And in that shared space, in the quiet understanding that blossomed between mother and daughter, there was a profound and enduring peace. The aroma of rosemary and garlic clung to the air, a fragile truce between the fading daylight and the encroaching night. Janelle watched her mother pick at the roasted chicken, a familiar furrow etched between her brows. Margaret's silence wasn't the comfortable kind that settled between them after years of shared meals. This was a strained quiet, thick with unspoken words and the weight of Janelle's carefully constructed plan. Will she see it as a betrayal? The thought pricked at Janelle, a sharp counterpoint to the warmth of the cottage. She'd poured her heart into this, renovating the small space with its wraparound porch and the overgrown garden Margaret would adore. A haven, a place where her mother could be safe, surrounded by care, but not suffocated by it. But what if Margaret saw only a cage? Margaret set down her fork, the clatter against the ceramic plate a stark sound in the deepening twilight. This is nice, Janelle. Her voice was thin, like worn silk. Janelle's stomach twisted. Nice. The word hung in the air, devoid of any real warmth. It was the kind of praise one offered a stranger, a polite dismissal disguised as a compliment. She forced a smile. It's small, I know, but I thought it might be manageable. Manageable. Margaret echoed the word, her eyes, once sharp and bright, now clouded with a disconcerting vagueness. Is that what I am now, Janelle? Something to be managed. A wave of guilt washed over Janelle. No, that's not it at all. Mom, it's just easier. Things are getting harder for you. And harder. Margaret's voice sharpened, a flicker of the woman Janelle remembered flashing through the fog of forgetfulness. I raised you on my own. I worked 2 jobs. I managed just fine. I know, Mom. I know you did. Janelle reached across the table, her hand hovering over her mother's. Margaret flinched, pulling away as if burned. The rejection, though subtle, was a physical blow. Janelle retreated, her hand falling back to her lap. The rosemary and garlic suddenly felt cloying, the cozy cottage closing in on her. Why is this so hard? The silence stretched, each tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner amplifying the chasm that seemed to widen between them with every passing second. Janelle could feel the carefully constructed facade of her composure crumbling. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, each iteration ending with understanding and acceptance. The reality was jagged and raw. Finally, Margaret sighed, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate her. I'm tired, Janelle. Her voice was barely a whisper, the defiance replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Janelle's heart ached. She rose and led her mother out to the porch, where the first stars were beginning to prick the darkening sky. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of honeysuckle from the neglected vines clinging to the porch railing. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Margaret leaned her head against the back of the rocking chair, her eyes closed. Janelle watched her, the lines etched on her mother's face softened by the dim light. A wave of tenderness washed over her, erasing the frustration and the sting of rejection. This was her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her, the woman who had taught her strength and resilience. And now, she was fading. I was so sure I'd be alone at the end. Margaret's voice was barely audible, laced with a vulnerability Janelle had rarely witnessed. Janelle reached out and took her mother's hand, this time meeting no resistance. Her mother's skin was paper-thin, fragile beneath her touch. You're not, you never will be. Margaret opened her eyes, her gaze locking with Janelle's. I didn't think anyone would ever stay. The words were a confession, a glimpse into a lifetime of hidden fears. I'm here, Mom. Janelle squeezed her hand, her own throat tightening with emotion. Love isn't always loud. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she needed to say those words, not just to her mother, but to herself. A faint smile, touched Margaret's lips. "I'm not fading, you're changing, and I'm here for all of it." The words, though simple, held a weight of understanding that transcended the years of unspoken emotions. As the night deepened, they sat together, wrapped in a shared silence that was no longer strained, but filled with the quiet comfort of acceptance. The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to a new chapter in their relationship, one built on mutual support, understanding, and a love that ran deeper than words. The cottage, once a symbol of contention, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could navigate the uncertain future together. The scent of honeysuckle mingled with the fading aroma of rosemary and garlic, a subtle promise of shared meals and quiet evenings to come.